Hi, BookTube, and welcome to another fiction review. Today's novel was a choice made for me. You'll remember back in April I did the birth year tag, and one of the questions asked me to read a book that was published in the year I was born, 1964. So I had to refer to the Wikipedia page for British novels published in 1964, and I had my fingers crossed because I'm on a Read What You Own challenge. Everybody must know that by now. And so I needed it to be a book that I owned if I was going to read it before November this year. And lo and behold, I did find one title which matched a book on my shelf. It was written by an author who is a firm favorite of the person who watches television. He's not read everything she's written because that would be quite an achievement. We are talking 67 novels, 9 novellas, and 9 collections of short stories. But he's read a fair bit. And if you've heard me talk about the reading tastes of the person who watches television, you know that we must be talking about a writer of crime fiction. Today's book was the author's debut novel. It was also the debut of her fictional detective, whose cases were adapted for television in 1987, and the show ran for 11 series. Today we are reviewing From Doon with Death by Ruth Rendell, first published in 1964 by a company called John Long Limited in London. They no longer exist. I think they're now just another part of Penguin Random House. I didn't put an ISBN number because there wasn't one on the original edition, but there have been so many different reprints. This cover is just an example of a dozen different covers I could see online, so you shouldn't have any trouble locating a copy of this book. Can I pitch the novel? This is a short and simple police procedural. It's actually the third novel Rendell ever wrote, but From Doon with Death was the first to get accepted for publication. Authors, it seems to me, they fall into two categories when they make their debut. Either their first novel is absolutely brilliant, groundbreaking, and they make a dramatic entry onto the A-list of published authors, or they make a more modest impression initially, and they build on that, they grow. Rendell is one of the second types, the modest impression type. This novel, it will not wow anyone. I feel safe to stick my neck out and say that I bet that will even be true if you have not read a lot of crime fiction before. If you have read a fair amount of crime or a great deal of Ruth Rendell's other work, this will be possibly a slightly disappointing read because it's not an example of the more complex and satisfying story structures that Rendell was producing later in her career. Book details. This book is 175 pages long. I can't say with absolute certainty where or when we got hold of the copy that I read. The person who watches television, he bought it. He had a bookmark tucked inside, like between the copyright page and the dedication page. And it was a ticket. It was a ticket to a cricket match that we watched in South Africa in December 2004. On that evidence, he must have bought it sometime before that, but I couldn't exactly say when. I did ask him if he would check his reading diaries and tell me when did he read it, to give me maybe, because he usually reads a lot of these things not long after he buys them. But in this case, he checked his diary a couple of times over and he can't find that he's ever read it. Quite something. So I would say this book has had a lucky break. If it were not for the birth year tag, it would have stayed even longer on our shelves. It just happened to have the good fortune to be published in the year that I was born. A little about the author now. Ruth Rendell was born in Essex in 1930. Wikipedia has this amusing little story about one of the early steps she took in her writing career. It says, after high school, she became a feature writer for her local Essex paper, the Chigwell Times. She was forced to resign. After filing a story about a local sports club dinner she had not attended, and so she failed to report that the after-dinner speaker had died midway through the speech. Rendell married another journalist when she was 20. Their first years as a couple were a big struggle financially. Ruth was writing and submitting short fiction. In an interview to the Guardian newspaper, she admitted these were not great stories, but she said, people were nicer then about turning you down, and so I didn't lose heart. From Doon with Death was started as an experiment, just to see if she could write a crime novel. From that first publication in 1964, Rendell produced a new novel every 2 to 3 years, 24 of which are police procedurals involving her Detective Inspector Wexford. And the gentleman you see in the photograph below me is the actor George Baker, who played Wexford in the television series. The rest of the books could be called explorations of dysfunctional or disturbed people in which criminal activity often happens. Rendell wrote some of these novels using her real name and some using the pseudonym Barbara Vine. Her books have won numerous awards, and it has been argued by some critics that the Booker Prize ought to have overlooked Rendell's association with genre fiction and considered some of her novels for inclusion in their long lists. Rendell was also politically active. She was a supporter of the Labour Party in the UK, and she was given a seat for life in the House of Lords in 1997. Her last published novel, Dark Corners, appeared in 2015, the same year that she died, aged 85. Regarding setting, Rendell was known to have mixed feelings about Agatha Christie and Miss Marple as a character in particular. And in From Doon with Death, Rendell showed her preference for setting her novels in towns and cities rather than in the country. All action takes place in Kings Markham. It's a fictional town and a couple of the nearby towns. The novel doesn't pinpoint your location, though, for a good 4 pages. It's funny, though, it mentions street names before that, as though you're already familiar with the place. I wasn't able to confirm, given that From Doon with Death was the 3rd novel that Rendell actually wrote, whether in her first or second novel she was more conventional in the way that she gave the location. You know, there's a way novels often open, and they use the initial pages as kind of a preamble. No action happens much, but you're really just establishing where you are and when the time period is, and perhaps introducing a couple of the principal players. Rendell doesn't do that. In From Doon with Death, she begins straight away with dialogue, and it's an uneasy dialogue as well. It's surrounding a possible missing person, and it includes a police officer. So from the opening sentence, you as the reader, you're right on the case. Then setting details from there are just dropped into the text as the investigation proceeds, and the amount of description really depends on what the viewpoint character chooses to notice and how much information they need to recall in order to give directions or name a local landmark or quote a bus timetable. Kings Markham is in the county of Sussex, and that's not mentioned until page 51, but the social demographic clearly suggests a town in the south or southeast of England. There are a great number of wealthy residents, and Rendell makes use of the contrast between them and more established but less well-off people to create some tension, some scope for longing, envy perhaps, but also to use that familiar trope that we know of the unhappy rich family with a lot of secrets to keep. I want to say something interesting about the narrative viewpoint and the narrative voice. The viewpoint is third person, and it stays almost exclusively with Wexford and Burden, the investigating officers. Rendell uses a lot of indirect discourse. So in other words, you get the narrative with the resonance of Wexford and Burden, the way they think, the way they talk. I'd say that's about a 50-50 split between that and just the narrator describing action. There's also plentiful dialogue, the inevitable interviews and discussions between officers. As a result, the reader is in very close sympathy with the police and removed from the other characters unless or until those characters are required to give information. So bear that in mind. It means the reader feels completely dependent on the analysis of the police and for their understanding of the suspects and the evidence. And this becomes a problem, you see, toward the end of the novel. Wexford and Burden need to organize a particular operation to discover who done it. The reader, who up until the end of chapter 13 has been following the investigation with them, knows all the evidence, it's been diverted with them to investigate all the red herrings. It literally has all the information the police do. And then suddenly, at the end of that chapter, it's pushed away from Wexford's thoughts. You just get some very cryptic remarks and some unexplained connections that are very sparse compared to what you've had previously. And then the action jumps forward to the operation itself, right in the middle of it. So the reader is denied any access into the thinking, the planning, and it's only this device, this deliberate creation of a blind spot for the reader, which prolongs the mystery. The mystery hinges also on an assumption about the killer's identity, and that would have been perhaps original in 1964, but definitely cliche now. I knew the identity issue at page 95, so about the halfway mark, and that was from, well, I won't give it away. I was gonna say how I found it out, but I thought, no, I'll leave that in case you do want to read it. Given the overused scenario of mistaken identity, and then this weird strategy of bringing the reader right into the thick of the investigation throughout, and then abruptly almost revoking their access, taking away their badge. I wouldn't blame any reader who concluded that this book must have been imagined by a less talented writer than Ruth Rendell. I have read 2 of Rendell's later novels, and the difference was considerable for me. From Doon with Death literally did not feel like the work of the same author. Rendell had yet to develop that edgy psychological suspense that she used in her novels that became her trademark. Does this novel fit a genre label? This may be the only Rendell novel that could be labeled cozy, and that's even though Wexford and Burden, they're not particularly likable characters, and I don't think they're meant to be liked. Rendell admired Agatha Christie for her plotting, but one thing she didn't like was her stereotypical characters. For example, she didn't like the fact that the victim was always someone everybody disliked, and the investigator was always a person who could charm and disarm whoever they came in contact with. There's always that question I ask, what, if anything, stands out as an aspect of this novel? This is not a standout novel. It's a good novel, but not a standout novel. As we learned in her biography, Rendell admits that From Doon with Death was an experiment, and it reads like a first attempt. I'm going to venture a guess that the editor at John Long Limited admired the quality of her prose and also her opening scene, which drops the reader right down into the most interesting and intriguing bit of dialogue. In fact, I'm going to read that. This is from page 9. "I think you're getting things a bit out of proportion, Mr. Parsons," Burden said. He was tired, and he'd been going to take his wife to the pictures. Besides, the first things he noticed when Parsons brought him into the room were the books in the rack by the fireplace. The titles were enough to give the most level-headed man the jitters, quite enough to make a man anxious where no grounds for anxiety existed. Palmer the Poisoner, The Trial of Madeline Smith, 3 Drowned Brides, Famous Trials, Notable British Trials. Don't you think your reading has been preying on your mind? "I'm interested in crime," Parsons said. "It's a hobby of mine." "I can see that." Burden wasn't going to sit down if he could avoid it. "Look, you can't say your wife's actually missing. You've been home 1.5 hours and she isn't here. That's all. She's probably gone to the pictures. As a matter of fact, I'm on my way there now with my wife. I expect we'll meet her coming out." "Margaret wouldn't do that, Mr. Burden. I know her and you don't. We've been married nearly 6 years, and in all that time, I've never come home to an empty house." Is there problematic content in the book? According to the British Council website, and there'll be a link to that in my description box, Ruth Rendell has repeatedly stated that she dislikes descriptions of violence or torture in her books. Even though From Doon with Death is a murder mystery, there are no frightening or violent scenes. There is no visit to the morgue to hear the pathologist describe exactly how the victim suffered, and there are no additional murders. That's why I chose to call this novel cozy. If you like your crime urban in the darker sense, more gritty, more shocking, then I recommend you try one of Rendell's later novels, particularly the non-Wexford books. And since we're on that subject and it's the next question, let's do recommendations for related or follow-up reading. If you've never read any Ruth Rendell and you want a taste for the kind of fiction that earned her the 20 million copies in sales, then I'm going to recommend my all-time favorite novel, Adam and Eve and Pinch Me. It was a title that drew me right away. It's a crime novel, but a different breed, so differently structured that it will not seem to be the thing that it is. But it is a demonstration of Rendell's genius for creating character. I read the book about 20 years ago, and I still have a clear mental picture of the protagonist, Minty. She kind of haunts the corridors of my reading memory. And that is another review done. You know, I got so much reading done while I was on holiday. I'm more than halfway through Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo, and more than halfway through X plus Y by Eugenia Cheng. Cheng brings a mathematician's logic and calm to the emotive topic of gender identity and gender inequality. She's provided me with what I wanted so badly. Ever since I went to see the Barbie movie, you might remember my video from last summer, I was wanting gender-neutral terms so that words like feminism and patriarchy could be retired, because I just don't think they're doing the best job that they could in helping to resolve the problems they're trying to describe. So I look forward to those reviews, making them for you over the next week. Good luck, everybody, with your June reading. I'll see you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.